HanselMinutes.com, it's Hansel Minutes, a weekly discussion with web developer and technologist Scott Hanselman, hosted by Carl Franklin. This is Lawrence Ryan announcing show number 140, recorded live Monday, December 1st, 2008. Support for Hansel Minutes is provided by Telerik RAD Controls, the most comprehensive suite of components for Windows Forms and ASP.NET web applications. Online at www.telerik.com. Support is also provided by .NET Developers Journal, the world's leading .NET developer magazine. Online at www.sys-con.com. In this episode, Scott talks about domain-driven design with Rob Conery.
Hi, this is Scott Hanselman, and this is another episode of Hansel Minutes. And I'm breaking the rules. I got Rob Conery on the show again. This is you were on the show in September, October, somewhere in there.
I feel so very lucky.
I've run out of guests, and now I'm doing repeats. It's just horrible. Famous people won't talk to me, so I'm talking to you.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, I'm glad to fill in, as always. I feel like Keith Olbermann on David Letterman.
Yeah, you are exactly like that. Does that make? I guess that makes me Letterman, which is not a bad thing.
No, exactly.
Well, actually, we people don't realize it. You and I, we talk daily, a couple times a day. You've come to the house. We talk all the time. So we work together a lot. We're working on a little project on the side right now. But one of the things that you've been working on is trying to learn a domain-driven design. And I think a lot of people really appreciate the way that you're learning in public. I think both of us kind of have that style. I mean, we know what we know, and we're very clear about what we don't know. And when we don't know something, we want to learn it. But why not learn it in public and have people learn with us? And you've been learning domain-driven design.
It generally seems like a good idea to do that because people do, as you're saying, appreciate the learning process. However, sometimes I do feel like I might just end up being the village idiot. It's hard to kind of put out what you don't know, and then oh my gosh, is that too much that I don't know? And then people say, oh, this guy doesn't know anything. But
yeah, I do think about that sometimes. I mean, there are some things that I feel good about, the things I've spent 10, 15 years learning and working on, but there's definitely stuff that I have no idea about. Someone will send me an email and they'll say, help me do this obscure thing in WCF, standing on your head. And it's like, I haven't spent as much time in WCF as I have in ASP.NET. I don't know.
Yeah.
But what do we do now? It's like, well, find somebody who knows. So that's what you did. Yeah. You found someone who knows domain-driven design. And the goal of this podcast is to talk about not what domain-driven design is necessarily and the final word on it, but what resources are available for people to learn this style of design. So what did you do? You decided you needed to learn this. Why?
Well, it was interesting. When I was doing the MVC storefront, I got to a certain spot where I said, okay, let's wrap this thing up. Let's put it to bed. And, you start going over your code and refactoring it, adding comments. And as I started to do that, as well as explain it to other folks internally at Microsoft, I realized that, there was a lot of what they call smell in there. There's just things that naming conventions, the ways I was carrying out logic that just didn't make sense. And I think it's natural for every project to get to a certain point where you say, okay, we gotta shake things a bit and restructure it to make more sense. And so that's the point I hit. And I said, well, a lot of people have been after me talking about domain-driven design, DDD, especially because I started using the repository pattern as my data access, and they kept saying, well, in DDD, this is what we do. I said, well, I'm not doing DDD. And I thought, well, maybe it's about time, because I know, one thing I do know is that DDD is about addressing complexity. And I felt like I got to a certain point of complexity with it all. So, yeah, that's what I'm doing. And yeah, I want to underscore what you just said one more time. This isn't me explaining how DDD works. This is me explaining how I'm learning it, and I hope that everyone understands that.
So let me back up a second. You said that this is like a refactoring. Like you got to a point in your MVC storefront where things smelled bad enough to change things. But you're still continuously refactoring. So how is this refactoring different from the kinds that you're doing all the time?
It's different because the approach that I took, the way that I separated the classes out, the way that let me see if I can give you a concrete example. Well, let me answer your question first. The way that I was kind of looking at the complexity of the site, usually it's sort of an intuitive thing. You get a flow going. Like, this is how this logic is carried out, where an order is processed, you go through these steps. It's always kind of a test when you try and explain that to somebody else and you stumble. And that's what was happening. Mm-hmm. So what I realized is it wasn't just a part of a refactoring step that I needed to do. It was actually a restructuring, so that it made sense. And I wanted to be able to look at Bertrand, who's my new manager, and say, well, the storefront works in X, Y, Z, and we use this pattern here. And so that's how I want it to be, to carry out, if that makes sense. Okay.
So where did you start?
Well, it was really tough to get started, because it's funny. The first person I talked to was Jeremy Miller. I sent him a little tweet, or a Skype message, and I said, "Hey, Jeremy, I really need your help. You're up on DDD, aren't you?" And his answer was really funny. He embraces DDD, and I don't want to speak for Jeremy in any sense, but one of the things he mentioned was that there's a difficulty with what he called the jargon explosion. And
I feel like. There are a group of people who speak with authority on a lot of these things, and there's DDD and BDD and all these different designs, and I didn't even know what kind of design we did at my last job, and we were a Scrum shop, we were an Agile shop. We did some design up front, and then we did the rest of it as we refactored. But
yes.
I think it was DDD-like, but there's only so many jargons and so many three-letter acronyms that one can possibly use at one time.
Exactly. And well, that's why, to come back to your question, that's exactly where I got started, was learning just what is this jargon. And unfortunately, one of the problems that DDD has, and this isn't me railing, this is just an issue, is that the jargon is insanely generic. So to give you an example, one of the things a concept that you learn is something called an aggregate root. And then another thing you learn is a bounded context. The term domain and the term entity are probably two of the most generic words in the English language. So you don't really have an innate understanding as you would if you're reading something based on like relational design, for instance. I mean, the term relational, it says a lot. How does data relate in a database? So that's the first place I started. Was I cracked open, I went down to Borders and I opened up Eric Evans' book, which is kind of considered the DDD Bible by a lot of people. It's tackling complexity and programming design or something like that. But anyway, it's Eric Evans' DDD book. It's blue. That's how you'll know it. And it's a great read. And it really is awesome. And the next one I got was Jimmy Nilsson's book, Applying Domain-Driven Design in .NET. And both of them are extremely helpful.
It is the Bible, or is it just I'm looking here on Amazon. One guy says it's just another patterns book. And and I hear when people talk about DDD, they spit out a whole bunch of new patterns that are not necessarily the gang of four patterns that I'm used to, although a lot of them are.
Yeah, that's what I put on my blog last week when I said I was, kind of taking a hard look at DDD. I said, really, DDD is a collection of patterns. And a lot of folks jumped on me in a good way to say, hey, it's way more than that. And it's true, it is way more than that. But the technical aspect is knowing some core patterning that really all of us have learned at some point, or may have learned, and it's just learning how to implement it properly to bring about what it is you're trying to do. There's a nice bland statement for you.
The things that I've read on DDD, though, are so, what's the word? Just kind of up in the sky, heady. They don't get into a lot of detail. There doesn't seem to be really good examples. And then people keep falling back and saying, oh, well, blah, 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 the repository pattern, blah, 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 the aggregate pattern. But I don't quite, I hear a lot of words, but I don't see a lot of clarity. Is this the feeling, is this the natural feeling one has when they start digging into this stuff?
It absolutely is. And I got really frustrated. I was told a bunch of conflicting things when I kind of twittered what I was wanting to do, and a couple people said to me, "Oh, DDD is something you can't refactor in," and I said, "Well, my goodness!" And then, how do you get started with it then? And someone else said to me, "Well, for what you're trying to do, it's not complex enough yet." And I said, "Well, if I don't have a level of complexity and I can't refactor it in, that doesn't make any sense. Where do I get started? It's catch-22." So I had a lot of frustration, but the interesting thing is, as I just slowly, patiently worked through that frustration, I realized that, and this is kind of segueing into the next phase of the discussion here, is that DDD is a lot about discussion. It's a lot about dialogue. In fact, it's 80%, probably 90% about dialogue. And only until I was working out this restructuring of the application did I realize how much dialogue is involved, and how that really is the cornerstone of it all, at least what I have interpreted it being. And I'll give you an example of that. I was trying to figure out, where exactly does a shopping cart live, and is really a shopping cart just an order? There's a lot of questions about how that plays out in e-commerce. Mm-hmm. And I talked to a nice guy, Ben Taylor. We had a Skype conversation yesterday, and he said to me, well, what you'd really want to do is sit down with your customer and ask them, well, how do they view a shopping cart? You just get to the concepts of it. And so I said, well, I don't really have a client. I can kind of remember what my old client, KLA Tencor, I built them an e-commerce site before. I can kind of remember what they're saying. And so we started this dialogue, and he started asking me about it. And in the course of the discussion, we nailed it. And it was because we used just regular English. We talked about, the concepts that are into the store, but we focused mainly on the business approach. And as we started talking through the business approach, it shook out the technology, which I thought was extraordinary. And it's funny because I was saying I'm frustrated by this because of X, Y, and Z, but he said, well, wait a minute, you just said the answer to your question right here, and he backed me up a little bit in my sentence. And I said, oh my gosh, I did, didn't I? So it was pretty profound.
Do you know how to make the possible out of the impossible? Well, the .NET ninjas at Telerik do. They just released a huge pack of web controls all built on top of ASP.NET Ajax that'll help you build impossibly fast and interactive applications in no time at all. They've made the impossible possible in desktop development. If you think you can't have a carousel component in WinForms, well, you can. Their Windows Forms suite features a super powerful grid view control and 32 other crazy desktop components that'll give you dazzling WPF-like features, but in WinForms. They do the same thing in reporting solutions with a new design surface like nothing else. Looks just like graph paper. Gives you advanced page layout capabilities. Makes it feel more like a graphic design software than a reporting solution. Go check them out at Telerik.com and be a .NET Ninja. And thanks for listening. Now that reminds me of a story I've told before in the show where one of my bosses used this term about the cell phone antenna all the time. This is his standard story that he would say. So basically, a guy walks into the cell phone provider and he says, "I need a bigger antenna." And you say, "Well, you need a bigger antenna." Well, what exactly do you need? And this is the customer saying, "I need a bigger antenna." In fact, the person is saying, "I need better cell phone reception." They're coming in with the solution. So this is like when the business person says something like, "I put the button right here," or "I think the page should lay out like this." Those aren't the kinds of things that the customer really needs to be focused on. Those are the kinds of things that you need to keep the customer away from. Focus on the problem domain and keep them away from trying to solve the problem for you. Don't let them tell you that they need a better cell phone antenna.
That's true, and part of what that process entails between the two of them, between you and your customer, is that that shield that you put up. In other words, don't focus on what I'm doing, or don't focus on the technology per se, but what you do is you come to their business, you get to know their business really well, but at the same time, you pull them into the technology a little bit. You tell them about, well, we have these things called entities and value objects and all these other things that you learn about in DDD. Mm-hmm. But pretty soon you're talking about the same thing. And to reflect back a little bit about the cart issue I just had, it was a lot easier when I was working with KLA Tencor before. It was a lot easier for them to sort of understand their process in terms of a cart. And so my customer would talk about a cart. He would talk about a customer. And so we began to sort of just talk that way. And that is what the term ubiquitous language is all about. And so as we start talking and I'm diagramming, he knows precisely what I'm talking about because I'm talking about a cart. And I say to myself, well, I might as well call it a cart because that's how he envisions it. And so now that you have these two things together, which is called the ubiquitous language, you can start as your foundation, which really led me to an aha moment when I started
just had
understanding.
that moment about 30 seconds ago.
What's that?
As you're speaking, I'm like, it's so funny how aha moments aren't the ones where your brain completely explodes and you realize that you're thinking about it all wrong. I used to think aha moments were like going from like point A to point Z and just skipping over all the other ones. It really is just an incremental thing. I mean, it's such an obvious statement. You just said that you wanted your design to use the same vocabulary that the business person was using. And that was removing the kind of impedance mismatch, you know? We spend so much time as developers trying to teach the business person technology. And that's completely wrong-headed because technology exists for one reason, and that is to make the business person money, right? Technology exists to move the business forward. So you're saying that you're creating your entities and your patterns in a language that the business person is familiar with, so that when he starts describing the business problem, and he's describing the entities and the patterns, such that you're going to go, oh yeah, well this is how the system actually works, so we're on the same page. I mean, the power of that statement, we are on the same page. I understand your language because we've spent so much time discussing the problem domain. Now we're speaking the same.
Yeah, and that's the term domain driven. It's domain means business. You model the business in a domain, and you stick to it very heavily. And it's nice because it's an affirmation of all the things that, you know, I think consultants have done, where they go in and they sit with the client and they reason through problems with them. And one statement that's made in, I think, the Evans book is, you know, how much more valuable of a consultant are you to, let's say, organization X? Let's say the organization makes airplanes. If you're an aeronautical engineer that happens to know .NET and C# really well, how much more valuable are you to them than just a really good C# programmer? Right. And so what the point of DDD is for you to strive to know the industry really, really highly, so you can actually solve their problems very well.
Right, which is kind of funny because it's a very Zen thing to just say, you know, return to the basics. What exactly are we trying to do here? You know, there's a lot of the meetings that I'm in, I try to remind people that the point of the meeting is to come up with the next actions to solve the problem and spend less time jabbering and more time really distilling things down to its basics. There's a really great blog up at Devlicious, if you're familiar with Casey Charlton, and he has a post called The Tao of Domain-Driven Design. And he says here, domain-driven design is the latest software fad, and it's already becoming a buzzword that recruiters are looking for. Every developer wants to do it, and many think they are doing it. I think that's really powerful. He says it's really about how developers remove the artificial boundaries that exist between IT, and the business we're there to support. It's just a very Zen thing. I mean, it's difficult to put one's finger on, and that may be why it's so easy to kind of throw rocks at. And they say, oh, that's just nonsense. That's not concrete.
Exactly. Well, it's also the main reason why it's difficult to explain. It's difficult for someone to get it across to somebody. I mean, if I was to say to you, Scott, tell me what Zen's all about, you know, you probably would try and come up with analogies, and you might slip some jargon in there, which is exactly the problem that DDD has. Right. And overall, one of the challenges that I think is facing DDD, which is something that I put the other day on Twitter, is to have somebody out there who can actually explain it in real terms, and that we've actually all been doing it. And if you're wondering, if you are out there listening and you're wondering, do I do DDD or do I not? Is this something that I've always been doing? The way to consider it is something that I considered myself, is when I walk into a client's office, or when I used to, do I look at what their problem is that they're telling me and say, oh, what you really need is this type of application. And you abstract their problem into your terms of understanding. That is a point of failure to a person who likes DDD. A DDD person would just sit there and listen and start diagramming, throwing objects up on the wall, and pretty soon you're both understanding the problem together, and you haven't abstracted their issue as a programmer would into your terms. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, I think that the way that I learn these kinds of concepts the best are when I hear a story about how it's succeeded. I think that when people say, well, give me specifics, some people want a cookbook. They want like step by step. Step 1, find a customer. Step 2, sit down with a customer. That kind of detail. For me, I prefer success narratives. When I want to learn a concept, like one of my favorite books is Eli Goldrat's The Goal. Have you ever read The Goal?
I haven't.
It seems dry, but it's basically a novel about a guy who runs a manufacturing plant. You never really learn what they're making. They just use like code words and stuff. They'll say, yeah, the InfoZork 1000, it's not being built correctly, da da da. And you never really learn what it is because it's not really the point. And the whole book is about a process of continuous improvement and how all these different characters get together and work out where the bottlenecks are in the manufacturing process and how they can, better figure out how to make this particular widget effectively. And the way that they do it is an ongoing process of improvement. They improve this, they improve that, and they puzzle it out. So you're reading about them thinking about, working through their own logic. And I think that, software books that are abstract, that include, lots of UML diagrams, are useful to me as a reference, but I really prefer reading about people's successes and failures, in much more concrete terms. I like reading blog posts about people's projects at work and what they're currently doing and how they're applying, something like, DDD to their life, the life that they're living right now. I know that Evan's book isn't really deep on specifics like that. Are there any resources or are there any blogs that people are talking about living DDD right now?
To be honest with you, I found most blog resources out there that talk about DDD, and this isn't meant to sound negative, but unfortunately it is. It's a lot of jargon thrown around and not very careful explanation about how to solve a particular problem. And the thing I'm building out here, which is an e-commerce store, is probably the ubiquitous sample, short of maybe the blog engine. And, I was looking at how people would solve this, and, I've looked online at sample applications, but sample applications are really not the things you should look at because they take theory to the nth degree. And I haven't found much of anything, to be honest with you, and that's probably just because I've only been looking for a couple of weeks here. But I hate to say it now. Jimmy Boggart is a good blogger. He's on Los Techies. He writes a lot about DDD. And I think Allende writes a decent amount on DDD. He doesn't really focus on it. But if you're looking to learn it by reading a set of blogs, I haven't found any. And that's not to say they're not out there, but hopefully some of your readers will.
Well, I enjoy reading Code Better, codebetter.com. I enjoy reading Devlicious. A lot of discussion of this happens in tiny, tiny little snippets on Twitter, but I keep getting emails from people saying, where do I start? And it's almost like saying, do you want to learn how to swim? Jump off this cliff, and good luck with that whole swimming thing.
Well, is that funny thing
is that the conclusion of our show here? That's not good.
No, not at all. I'm going to tell you all about how I'm doing this, and hopefully I can do it in short order. So the segueing into the next part, so I had that initial understanding of trying to slice up the problem and figure it out in a different way. Because before I was looking at it like a developer, much, much too much like a developer. So what I decided to do is to break it down and restructure everything. And so a couple nice ways that, or a couple nice things that came out of reading these books were software patterns that they really favor because of the way they loosely couple designs and other patterns, loosely couple designs and complexity of the solution. So I'm throwing jargon at you. I can't stand that.
Okay, so break it down.
Yeah, so what I did was, the first concept I learned was the concept that Dave Larrabee told me about, which was the bounded context. Now, what that means simply is that when you sit down and you create a domain, a set of entities, things called services, which I'll go into in a second, you put them in a specific context. Now, in an e-commerce application, you have actually two contexts at the very beginning. The first context is sales. where you're actually trying to sell something. That's what the UI is mostly about in an e-commerce store. So, you have specials, you have all these other things, try and get the person to put something in their basket and boom, sell it. That's context 1. Context 2 is actually order fulfillment. Those are 2 really separate and very specific domains to look at any system. So that was the first thing. So once I got past that, I kind of said, okay, I'm being business focused. I set up 2 applications or 2 libraries that did just that. And then I focused hard on the second thing, or let's say the second and third thing that go together. The second thing is the repository pattern, which we've been using in the past. But now that I'm focusing on DDD, it's got a little bit of a separate meaning. The repository is simply where your entities are created from. I think most people understand that from hearing the repository before. So the final thing that goes together here is the thing called unit of work. Again, a pretty bland term, but what unit of work represents is it's sort of a holder for your objects. If I'm explaining this properly, it manages the state of the objects that you're playing with. So if you're familiar with Link to SQL and you use the data context, that data context represents a unit of work. You ask it for some entities, you work with those entities, you might add some entities to that, and then you say, okay, submit everything at once. That, when you say submit everything at once or submit all changes, that is known as a unit of work and kind of an atomic addition into a database. Okay. Now, so I started focusing on those aspects and implementing them into the project. The next thing I had to understand was the difference between entities and value objects. Now, this to me was just really hard because entities are literally anything, and a value object says nothing to me. So I had to look and basically understand what that means. Now, the difference is an entity is something you care deeply about in terms of its identity. Do you want to persist it? Do I care about it 2 weeks from now? So in a sense, in your application, an order is something you care deeply about, and an order has a specific identity that you need to work with. However, an address may not be. In a system that just simply has an address that will define where you're shipping something to, you don't really care. It is just there simply to decorate or to kind of add value or add a description to an order. So that would be what's called a value object. The main difference is that a value object has no setters, primarily. It is only, it's only has gets on it. And the main reason why is you don't want it to change. And so you start setting up those kinds of rules, it starts to make sense. Like you set up these lines and these boundaries inside your application, and you start to see things take shape. Now I'm going to take a slight tangent here and say that these patterns, the way you can think about this in your mind, is in terms of relational theory. So that's the neat thing about a database, is that we have relational theory, if we're talking about a transactional database, where tables have very strict ways that you're supposed to go down and follow normalization and relational theory in the way you structure it. So everybody pretty much agrees. And, there's variations, of course. All this is a type of relational theory for how you build out your application. In other words, what pattern do I use to represent this status change? How does a customer have a shopping cart, or does a shopping cart have a customer? You see what I'm saying? So then you if you don't know the answer, you go back to your client and you talk to them. And you figure it out in the dialogue. So that's kind of how it comes together. Now, what I'm finding here is a ton of confusion as I restructure my application. Like, the questions I'm bringing up now, even on down, does a product have categories, or does a category have a product? And the answer turned out to be neither. I found that out by having discussions with my friends and talking about the problem that I was trying to solve. And I normally do that with a client. I don't have a client per se. But I talked to Allende one day, and he said, well, this is the grouping of the two is not a concern of either one of them. It's actually a bit of logic that lives sort of tangentially to it. It's a service. And that's what a service is in DDD, is a kind of a logic dump that it handles something that an entity otherwise wouldn't. And so you start to see these patterns play out, and you think, okay, well, I can start restructuring, putting things together. And as it comes together and you look at it, it really makes you feel good. It's a little bit of Zen thrown in the code, and you say, oh my goodness, this is awesome. Now, I just threw a bunch of stuff at you, and I'm sure you have questions. Does it kind of all go together?
I'm trying to bring that back to the relationship with the customer. Now, in your case, you don't really have a customer, though.
Exactly.
Right, because you're living in a little microcosm that doesn't necessarily reflect reality. So do you think you're really getting the truth about how this works when you are your own customer?
That's a great question. And someone pointed, I'd say 10 to 20 people pointed it out to me when I got started.
Just 10 to 20?
Only 10 to 20. Yeah, believe it or not. No, but the truth about it is I'm focusing on my old client that I think is your pretty standard kind of large corporation, that does e-commerce and the problems that they had and how they envisioned stuff. I'm not going into it as deeply as they'd had, but I'm kind of looking at things in the way that they would have, if that makes sense. Was working with them for 6 years, so I know their business inside and out.
Okay.
And I know how they would answer these questions, because I got to know my client that well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But still, I think though that I know that when I was doing agile work and learning from guys like Jim Shore about how to really get started, the on-site customer was very fundamental, and I still believe. And when we say the on-site customer, we mean ideally they've moved into a cubicle next to you, but it means constant and ongoing, continuous communication because things like big upfront design, a bunch of work, and then customer acceptance testing is where you'll get
Right.
nailed. That's where the customer says, do something, you go running in the wrong direction, and then they say, no, over here, this direction. And then you spend a lot of time running around in circles rather than running in a straight line. Mm-hmm. It seems like DDD refines that such that not only is there this ongoing relationship with the customer, but you're trying to make sure that the language that you're using, as they say, that ubiquitous language is one that is absolutely clear. It's clear to both of you, and all the way down to the point where the software design, the patterns that you use, and the code that you write aligns with the business and with the expectation that customer has. Does that sound right?
And let me give you a specific example of the way that you might reason this out as a developer trying to implement a pattern that is kind of handled in DDD. Mm-hmm. One might be like the idea of creating an order. And there's a lot of different considerations when you create an order. Like, are you creating it new so that you're going to jam it through the process, or are you creating a different type of order, like a PO that might have a PO to it? So what you could do is, in traditional kind of C# programming, is just create constructor overloads. Mm-hmm. And over time, as the complexity grows in your application, you might end up with 3, 4, whatever constructor overloads. Well, what DDD would say about that is, when you look at those overloads, do they make sense? Would they make sense to your customer if you're trying to explain what those overloads mean? And 99% of the time, the answer would be no, because each one of the signatures on those constructors means something to a programmer. But that doesn't necessarily mean what they do. So what DDD would say at that point is, well, you got a certain level of complexity here. Let's implement the factory pattern. And so you'd create a thing called an order factory that has specific logic in it. Now, what's that logic? Well, you sit down with your customer and say, well, hey, when someone phones in an order, so in the case of KLA-Tencor, my client, I would say, when someone phones an order in for a massive manufacturing machine, what do you do? And they say, well, we pull out an order sheet, and that order sheet has these, the name and what the client wants, and a couple other things. Like, oh, okay. So, when do you always use the same sheet? And we go through this Q&A, and by the end of it, I say, okay, well, let's mirror what the factory does according to what they do. Mm-hmm. And you can even use the same thing. Create new order for client, create new order for star client, whatever. Now the signatures become extremely clear. The logic is isolated as you've determined it from your client. That little bit of logic is isolated in that factory. It makes great sense. And then when you show it to your client, they understand it.
Cool. So this does assume, which is I guess a reasonable assumption, that their existing business process is working, such that you would in fact want to,
right.
You would in fact want to mirror it.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And to follow up, just one last thing. I know we don't have too much more time, but I've decided that for the storefront, I want to break out what I'm doing here, this restructuring stuff, into about 3 or 4 episodes. I've got recorded time from Dave Larrabee, from Allende, Jimmy Boggart, and I'm going to probably talk to Scott Bellware as well to get their take on what I'm doing, which I think will be interesting, to say the least.
Have you talked to the alt.net podcast guys? You should do it with them. I
have an alt.net podcast tomorrow with James Avery. I'm talking specifically about this. Yeah. So, I have an ulterior motive here, which is to kind of bring DD into the light, which is funny because it's one of the DDD core tenets is to bring problems into the light. Not that alt.net is a problem, but, or DDD or anything is a problem, but I'm trying to bring it into the light because it's been a sore subject with people. You blog about it, and if you get it wrong, people correct you, and I'm sure I'm going to be corrected today. But that's okay because it talks a little bit to the point you made before about continuous learning. And that is one of the points of DDD is to always learn and to always think and to always talk. So it's good.
Yeah. Well, I think it's great. So it sounds like the way that people can learn more about DDD is, as opposed to just randomly searching for it on the web, they can start by taking a look at the alt.net podcasts that are going to be coming in the next couple of weeks that you're going to be working on. They can check a look at your blog. They can get involved in the conversation, and they can certainly read the Domain-Driven Design book by Eric Evans.
Absolutely. And for what it's worth, what I'm mostly going to be focusing on with the storefront is my journeys in learning, not necessarily what I think is correct. So that's just worth throwing out there.
Cool. Well, Rob Conery, thanks so much for sitting down with me today and chatting.
No, thank you, Scott.
All right. Well, this has been another episode of Hansel Minutes, and I'll see you again next week.